Yes, you are. Thank you. Go ahead. You'll have 5 minutes.
Thank you for this opportunity. I'm speaking to you today from the other side of the coin. Most speakers have talked about how to spend money. I'd like to talk about where we can find some money to spend. And I'll also speak a little bit about citizen input. There isn't enough money to run the city properly, and there hasn't been enough for years, decades, in fact. It's time to fund our city properly. There's talk of taking 1% from the sales tax. This would net us somewhere between $750 and $1 billion each year. And I just hope that Mayor Tory's most diplomatic efforts will succeed. This would be just great. A staff report titled 2021 Updated Assessment of Revenue Options examined a commercial parking tax. A commercial parking tax of between 50 cents and 150 and $1.50 per day per space will yield between 191 and $575 million each year. The program will take about 18 months to implement, and we should do this. If we do, we will not be alone. New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Montreal, Vancouver all have some form of this tax. To apply this new tax fairly, I have two suggestions. First, calculate the amount of tax by distance from good transit. Maximum at Main and Danforth, where I live, near zero near the zoo or in Rexdale. Secondly, small businesses with only one or maybe two spaces should be exempt. It's been proposed that this tax be dedicated to transit. And if that were the case, we would get noticeably better transit and we could take cars off the road. Compared to increasingly worse congestion and increasingly worse service, I think that people will support this tax. Now, we're counting on contributions from Ottawa and Queen's Park. If they fall short, I suggest we consider walking away from the Gardner, or at least putting it on hold. The total cost of reconfiguring the Gardner is $1.8 billion, and we're currently spending around $200 million a year on it. This might sound like a radical move, but when viewed in the context of the broader fiscal state of things, I'd say we have no choice. And just a couple of words about citizen input. I think it's great that anyone can speak to this committee about the budget. I'm sorry to say that when input comes at the end of the process, there's room for little more than one or two items. New ideas, even really good ideas, are for next year, maybe. Let's reserve one day at the beginning of the process. For example, I'd like to suggest one of my own brilliant ideas. Buildings are the greatest source of greenhouse gas in the city, and most of that comes from natural gas. The price of natural gas is going up, and we need to generate more electricity to power heat pumps to replace that natural gas. What if we levy a charge to connect new buildings to natural gas or to expand an existing connection? Then, what if we use that money to provide a subsidy to the cost of connecting solar power to the grid? It's expensive to connect to the grid, but we need that extra power. And along the same lines, perhaps a reminder of the strong neighborhood strategy at the beginning of the budget process will see that program fully and generously funded so that we don't feel the need at the end of the process to find an additional $50 million for the police at the last minute. Toronto used to be known as New York is run by the Swiss. Sorry to say we're not now and haven't been for a long time, but we can become that again. I appreciate the committee's time and attention. I hope that the committee and the mayor will find a way to use the pressure of the COVID emergency to recast the city's financial structure to be truly balanced so that we can begin to consider the value as above the cost of what we do. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your deputation. Are there questions? Councillor Thompson has a question for you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and through you to Mr. Booth. Mr. Booth, thank you very much for your very thoughtful and effective presentation today. I just wanted to ask you a question with respect to the parking levy. And no doubt, we have looked at it for some time now and reports are coming forward. I don't know what the status of that is today. However, in light of the last 2 years with respect to COVID, would you suggest that we look at implementing that as part of a go forward currently, or do we wait until such time that businesses have rebounded in order to implement such a levy? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I really appreciate your question, and I gave it a lot of thought before suggesting that we move forward with it. It's going to take 18 months to really get going. I think that small business has suffered the most, and I think those are the kind of businesses that have only 1 or 2 parking spaces, and I think they should be exempt. I mean, we could also have an exemption based on square footage, or I'm sure there are other kind of standard measurements of what small business is. But the cost per space of a maximum of $1.50 a day, I think if a building is even just holding on by its fingernails, that it can probably handle $1.50 a day per space. Because I think that businesses that have a lot of spaces, I just think that they would be more like corporations, and their chances of having survived and beginning to right themselves, or beyond beginning, I think we'll be okay. I don't think we're going to hurt anybody with this.
Thank you very much for your response, Mr. Booth. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I also want to acknowledge Councillor Myers, who is joining us here this afternoon. Any other questions? Mr. Myers, just to talk a bit. So, try that again. Booth, Mr. Booth, Councillor Myers. Okay, got the two of them correct there. With regard to, you mentioned the numbers, $100 million, upwards of $500 million. I believe the larger number looks at every parking space in the city. You mentioned exemptions. So when you're looking at exemptions, small businesses, it doesn't make sense that we would be putting a charge on them. Strip malls out in Scarborough, out in Etobicoke, when you're looking at all these strip malls. So are you expecting, when we're looking at this, to charge those kind of areas or not?
Well, I think it depends on how many spaces there are. I know that in a lot of cases, in developments like strip malls, that spaces are allocated per store. Your rent includes X number of spaces as part of the calculation. So, if the store is kind of responsible for 1 or 2 spaces, leave them alone. If there's more than that, then there's a modest fee.
So,
I mean, we're talking about a couple of bucks a day here. It's not huge money.
So again, that's an interesting distinction there. You mentioned that in these strip malls that you would, if there's 1 or 2 spaces, 3 or 4 spaces, you would charge the actual owner the money instead of the person who would be using the parking space. Is that correct?
The tax could be implemented in all different kinds of ways. I mean, a strip mall could decide to charge people. It could decide have a separate parking fee, or the landlord could take it, or it could be charged directly to the rent of each business. Honestly, I haven't thought it through to that extent, and I think there should be a certain amount of flexibility offered.
Yeah, and again, when you're looking at large malls across the city, you got the Yorkdales, you got the Scarborough Town Centre right across from us. So when you're looking at parking downtown, you go into a parking space, you're going to be charged an extra $1.50 when you go out to pay. But when you're looking at the logistics of administering this with the larger malls, so how would they be charging the individuals who are coming into the malls, coming into the parking spaces, or is this again just a tax added on to the rents of all of the people who are in the mall? And how this parking levy has been suggested, this is a parking levy on people who drive, but how do you administer And this is one of the challenges that the report brought out a couple of years ago, and this is prior to the pandemic, is how do you charge large parking lot owners for the ability, it could be $1.50, but frankly, this will end up being a tax on businesses as opposed to a tax or a levy on people who drive. Wouldn't that be correct?
I'm not sure that it's entirely correct. I want to stress one thing before I more fully answer. We're talking about a maximum of $1.50 per day per space, not per hour. So, if you park for an hour, I don't think you would expect much of a fee for that. And again, I think really we have to be flexible with the way the money is collected. It's charged per space. And if a development like a mall allocates a certain number of spaces per store, then the mall can directly charge specifically a tax for those spaces, add it to the rent, um, whatever works. There are different financial arrangements between landlords and tenants. And I think they should be allowed to deal with this fee in the way that works best for them.
Okay, and I think it's just my last question with regard to what Councillor Thompson mentioned. This is really, again, we're looking coming out of the pandemic, the burden. I mean, we are doing from a city's perspective what we can to ensure to every business, small and large, has an opportunity to succeed. This, from what I'm looking at, is really a tax on business. And you're comfortable with doing this tax on business in a post-pandemic world?
I am, and I say that with the hope that if this can contribute to really good transit, the kind of transit where you say, "Why would I drive?" That I think it will ultimately help business.
Thank you very
If
much.
you can't get there, if it's a pain to get to a store to go shopping, then you're not going to go. It should be really good transit so that it's easy to get around.
Thank you. Councillor Moyes has a question for you.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Booth. Can you hear me? Is this working?
Mhm.
Are you able to hear me, Mr. Booth? Thank you for your
Yes, I am.
thank you for your delegation. So you mentioned Montreal and Vancouver and Chicago and New York. They all have parking levies, commercial parking levies. Are they all universal, uniform, or are they geared towards the city itself?
I didn't look into it enough to know the details of how these levies are implemented. I know that some of them have different rates depending upon the section of the city where the lot is located. Some of them are charged only to parking lots where you have to pay to park. But I really don't know the details, and I can't speak to it in any kind of detail.
Okay, fair
I
enough.
know that I think it's important to point out that technology has advanced to the point where I'm sure we can use technology to implement this fee gracefully and efficiently and fairly.
Okay, I mean, I know the answers to these questions, but I cannot give it to them to you, unfortunately. I'll ask another question. I'll ask another question.
Sure.
Is it the intent for these parking levies to be paid by the landowner or by the individual person who's renting the spot?
I think it could be either. I think whatever works best for a particular commercial location. It depends on the financial relationship between the landlord and the tenant business, or it depends. There's just too many situations. I don't think we should tie people's hands.
And in regards to a parking levy, if it were to be implemented here in Toronto, is it who decides how this is structured? Is it the council or is it the individual themselves?
I'm not sure I understand your question. What do you mean by how it is structured.
Well, if this parking levy were to come into effect here in Toronto, your assumption would be that, you know, it would be the city council here that would determine how it would be implemented. For example, there could
Right.
be a different rate, let's say, in the core of the downtown versus the suburbs here in Scarborough, where I'm at today.
It certainly should be, yes.
It could be the council that decides whether schools or religious institutions are exempt. Would that be your assumption?
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
I totally agree, yes.
All right. Thank you. Those are my questions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Booth.
Thank you. Thank you